that make a positive difference to the lives of people, changes that gives people decision-making power over their own lives and destiny, individually and collectively. This should not be confounded with change in the sense of a Schumpeterian creative destruction in modern market capitalism, because everybody talks about change. The creative destruction sees the competitive, only semi-religious believers will join a radical sect but will not connect with the people at large. Looking backwards, we sometimes can understand better the importance of maintaining this link between positive change and long-term vision. Let me explain what I mean by comparing two movements of revolutionary change during the 20th century. This year is the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Leon Bronstein and Vladimir Ulyanov, these two intelligent, passionate, and charismatic Russian revolutionaries, better known as Trotsky and Lenin, replaced Marxist orthodoxy of historical materialism by revolutionary voluntarism and consolidated the anti-Tsarist discontent of the masses into a party dictatorship to build a socialist future. The October Revolution resonated with millions of people around the world. The radical part of the international labor movement rallied to its defense and sacrificed convictions, principles, the idea of democratic socialism, and many even their lives for defending the citadel of anti-fascism and anti-capitalism. However, with hindsight, we must say the great October Revolution failed. The utopian power of the socialist idea did not survive the depressing reality of Stalinist terror, forced collectivization, economic inefficiencies, environmental degradation, and finally, gerontocratic stagnation. At the end, it all imploded as even the party bureaucrats were unwilling to defend it. With it, also, the confidence in a revolutionary act of liberation evaporated, and this left the radical left disarmed. The flame of the October has lost its imagination. It might be resurrected at some time in the future. Who knows? But I don't see any signs of it in the moment. Let's compare this experience with the other mass movement of improving living conditions that led to the probably most fundamental change of the last 100 years, feminism. At the beginning of the 20th century, women were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to make any business decisions of their own. Women were de facto excluded from higher education. In sports, no women were seen. Nearly all leadership positions were occupied by men, and many prestigious jobs, from lawyer to doctor to professors, were men's only. Sexual abuse was rarely a matter of discussion. Abortion was a crime, and feminists were looked at as the modern equivalent of medieval witches. Don't get me wrong, there are still many forms of gender discrimination. It persists in many countries, and nearly all have experiences of that. But I think it cannot be denied that future historians will probably look at the last 100 years as the most radical change in gender relations in the history of humankind. In a permanent revolution of incremental change, there's not the one revolutionary moment of regime change, and its fundamental impact only becomes really visible in retrospective. Fundamental change is the outcome of endless process of change, and in this process, progress is always possible and never guaranteed. But this demands for change have to be visionary and practical at the same time. It is the quantity of small and not so small changes that result in a qualitative transformation over time. Some who know me might ask themselves why I choose the women's movement and not social democracy as the mirror image of the failed transformation through revolutionary power grabbing. Well, we see that social democracy is massively losing support in its heartland in Western Europe and in other parts of the world. The decline of social democracy is nearly universal, and it cannot be explained by failure of particular party leaders or some country-specific situations. There are several reasons for that. The implosion of the Soviet Union, the rise of globalization have changed the power balance in society. The rise of globalization meant that the economic and political elite saw even the advanced capitalist countries no longer the same need for inclusive capitalism. As so ably explained by Professor Patnaik in the opening speech of this conference, globalization also globalized the industrial reserve army. Global capital mobility and the ability to relocate industrial production to other parts has changed the balance of power. To the extent that capital liberated itself from national constraints, including liberating itself from the obligation to pay taxes, redistributive policies were increasingly limited to socialism within one class. In other words, the revenues for social policies had to come from taxing the broad middle class. And a considerable part of the middle class became hostile to redistributive policies where the rich systematically evade their tax obligations and use their economic power to increase corporate welfare measures. Or as Joseph Stiglitz put it once, it has become a government of 1%, by 1%, and for 1% of the people. Following electorate defeats in the 70s and the triumph of the West in the Cold War, it looks that social democracy decided, if you can't beat them, join them. As social democracy accepted the liberalization of capital through globalization as the inevitable necessity of modernization, it became hostage to a logic that was contrary to its own values. The German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, and I'm sure you can find similar quotes from many other social democratic leaders of that time, famously said there are no right or left-wing economic policies anymore, but only stupid or smart economic policies, implying that his government would try to do smart policies to help Germany to become globally more competitive. However, the decision of his government to lower the tax for the rich by 14 percentage points, to create a massive low-pay sector through labor market deregulation, to support financialization as a good way to increase market efficiency, forcing trade unions to weaken industry-wide wage bargaining setting, did not prove particularly smart for social democracy. Not surprising, a strategy to reduce the income and protection of workers for the sake of international competitiveness did not really met an enthusiastic response of the working people. I don't think that Gerhard Schröder, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, François Hollande acted as deliberate traitors to the cause of labor. The tragedy is that they and many of their political friends and followers at that time genuinely believed that they were doing the right thing, that there was no better alternative to their policies. It shows the totality of neoliberal hegemony in the 90s, how successful they colonized the thinking even of their opponents. Social democracy gave up any passionate vision of real change, but tried to convince society at large, and capital in particular, that they are the most intelligent managers of modern capitalism. Clinton, Blair, Schröder, and the others, and also many socially democratically oriented people at international institutions like the UN, the ILO, or even the World Bank, fully accepted global capitalism and reduced the social democratic vision of social justice to education and skills development as the individual path to earn your own social justice. So it seems to me that the labor movement got it wrong and feminism got it right. Got it right in fighting for greater gender equality on all fronts, like access to education, gender-neutral language, closing the gender pay gap, demanding equal legal status, fighting sexual abuse, demanding gender quota, and insisting on affirmative action, while not losing sight of the radical program to fully transform gender relations throughout society. The women's movement succeeded to change the discourse radically. No one dares to argue publicly that girls should not have the same access to education. Arguing that women are not capable of rational political judgment and should therefore not have the right to vote is unimaginable today, but was fairly widespread 100 years ago. It is seen today as a scandal that only 30% of parliamentarians are female. But people are not bothered that you cannot find hardly any worker in the parliament, or not a single person in the US Senate is not a millionaire. The women's movement scandalizes unequal gender representation in public and private institutions, while labor fails to raise in a similar way this voice against social exclusion of working people. There seems to be, I feel, sometimes less passion about social exclusion than there is passion in the feminist movement for gender equality. You might argue that capitalism can incorporate gender equality easier in its accumulation model than the ideas of social justice and equity of the labor movement. I'm not sure about this. I think on micro and macro level, capitalism tends to adapt to changing power relations. Whenever there was a demand for change, be it the abolition of slavery or child labor, the introduction of unemployment insurance, the right to strike, capital was predicting economic disaster. But in reality, to borrow the title of this conference, we saw the reincarnation of capitalism. If the rules of the game change, they adapt the strategies of profit maximization to the new rules. While the gender discourse has been changing radically in favor of gender equality, in economics we have seen the opposite. The hegemony of neoclassical economic theory has turned economics into a world of highly sophisticated models based on simplistic semi-religious assumptions. I think it's fair to call it semi-religious, as even the great financial crisis that proved the assumptions of markets balancing itself to rational expectation is utterly wrong did not shape the profession and the truth of their almighty theories. Admittedly, the crisis has slightly increased the space for policy debate. It is no longer like in the 90s, when in public debates, those questioning the nearly unconditional supremacy of the market were just smiled at. They were hardly be seen worth an argument. They were rather looked at as the dinosaurs of a gone period who just failed to understand the imperatives of modernity. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about. One of these dinosaurs is speaking to you right now. Don't get me wrong. The structural constraints of global capitalism cannot be voluntarily wished away. But it is a fundamental difference to embrace them as inevitable and see the most successful adaptation to this logic as the ultimate goal of politics, or to think about initiatives to resist and ultimately overcome the subordination of the people under the iron logic of the so-called market forces. It's just not true that there's no policy space. And I can shorten my speech because Jayati so eloquently raised all these points just half an hour ago. It's not true that it's impossible to use national and international rulemaking to govern the market. It's not true that there's no alternative to total capital mobility. It is not true that tax evasion cannot be tackled. It is all not easy, but not easy and impossible are not the same. There are always alternatives, and if progressive ones are missing, if we don't have the alternatives, reactionary ones will be chosen. This is what we are witnessing today. The people are voting against a system that does not deliver for them. An important reason for the turn to the right has been the double vacuum on the left. Revolutionary radical power grabbing has largely disappeared or continues as nostalgic rhetoric not speaking to anyone but the converted. Social democracy shifted from incremental change with a transformative vision towards efficient repair and maintenance of the existing regime. Giving up any passionate vision on real change, but trying to convince society at large, and capital in particular, that they are the most intelligent managers of modern capitalism. While the rising inequality is an important reason for this turn to the right, it would be short-sighted to see this as the single reason. The discomfort with the system is not limited to economic issues. It is also the dissatisfaction with the commodification of lives that seems to replace all rules, traditions, values, and interpersonal relations by a hierarchy of individual purchasing power. The inability of governments to defend national sovereignty against globalization and financialization is another factor. And in richer countries, let's be honest about this, also there's not much sympathy for global mobility of labor. People in the North are not so keen to give up their privileged position on the planet. And it is a hard sell. It is a hard sell to poor people in the North to show solidarity with the far poorer people in the world, if at the same time they are losing to growing inequality and poverty in their own societies. Those of us, like myself, who live a privileged life in diverse, vibrant, but nicely gentrified inner city communities, should not underestimate the comfort and security homogeneity provides to people. In a society where many rules and norms are fully internalized by a large majority, people get easily the feeling that their way of life is unquestionably the right way of life. Life how it ought to be. It provides a cultural stability that people like, and they feel offended if they are increasingly regarded as a 21st century hilly-billy. There is a rise of majority identity politics against diversity, minority identity politics, and the cultural shifts that are shaking their traditional values and worldview. The right wing is managing to construct a narrative combining anti-globalization, injustice, racism, identity, tradition, family values, homophobia, Islamophobia, law and order, that speaks to lots of people and can be summarized in the slogans: frustrated of the world, unite against those weaker and poorer as yourself. In my view, we need to develop an alternative narrative, addressing a variety of policies that can make a change to the life of people and liberate elements of our lives and our societies from the imperatives and the structural logic of global capitalism. Let me map out a few areas that, in my view, need to be part of such a narrative. The first is globalization. I think we should clearly say there has to be a limit of speculative global capital flows. Remember the Tobin tax. For many years, the Tobin tax was regarded as a totally unpractical, loony left idea. Suddenly, after the financial crisis, lots of people were talking about, yes, we have to do something in limiting it. There was a shift in the debate. And then, as you know, after a couple of years, basically, everything went back to business as usual. The second point is closing tax havens. Don't tell me that you can't close tax havens. If the European Union or the US would say, look, you can do business either in Frankfurt or London or New York or on the Cayman Islands, it's your choice, but you can't do business at both places, it would be over. It would be over. It's very simple to close these tax havens if there's a political will. And there's nothing which would stop capitalism from functioning, but it would bring back the ability to tax what needs to be taxed. We have to rethink trade. I think we have to have the courage to say we need unequal trade. We need unlimited access to the markets of the North or the South, and we need the right of the South to protect their markets. If we want to have a way of greater equity on the planet, that has to be the demand, and that has to be also explained to working people in the North. And it's also been explained, you can't have it both ways. You can't increase the poverty in the South and then say we don't want the people to come. Either you change that balance or you have to deal with the people who come to your place. And I think we have to rethink development. We have to rethink development in a way that it is not a concept of catching up. It must be a concept of shortcuts, if I may say so, to more inclusive and better societies, which does not go to the same path the North has been going. Another area I think we have to think about is democratizing our societies and economies. And democratizing means democracy in all areas of society. It starts with the right of pupil at the school. It includes the right to have representation at a university. It includes the right to be represented through trade unions at the workplace. It includes, obviously, election. It includes also decision-making at international level. I think, and it includes a concept of regulating our public space. It's the points of regulation Jayati was speaking out, but I think it also means we have to have a regulation of the way elections are financed. We have to have a regulation how our media are working. What a nonsense to say that if 5 people own all the media, that's freedom of speech. And we have to have a public outlet to express diverse opinions if we want to have a democratic society. But also, I think, talking about labor, we have to democratize ourselves. Sometimes I think for the trade unions, it's the same true like for a good marriage. The key point is not to find the right partners. The key point is to be the right partner. And you cannot expect that the whole civil society follows the decision of your trade union Congress conference. If you want to build alliances, you have to build an open spirit of cooperation. And I think you have to be exemplary in the way you run your own organization. How can we demand democracy if our own organizations are not democratic, genuinely democratic? How can we call for inclusiveness if we are exclusive ourselves? How can we fight for respect at the workplace if trade union leaders do not even respect their own staff? Trade unions also have to be the mass schools of democracy and civil education. Being organizations within people can grow as personalities and develop their capabilities. The labor movement has to be the place for people to generate a spirit of belonging, participation, and self-fulfillment. And I think networks like the GLUE, like other ways where people, like-minded people, come together in the broader sense of the labor movement, are these places which have to give this space that people also grow themselves. And I think we have, in our political convictions, have to be authentic. I mean, no one is an angel. We all live in contradictions. But I think there must be a permanent effort to live what we preach. If we talk about a society of equal respect, of solidarity, of friendship, of support, then that has to be an expression of our daily political practice. Because that's what will connect other people to a movement. Now, but there are obviously also a number of policies which are so obvious if we want to have another narrative. One is bringing back the preconditions for an inclusive society. You can't have an inclusive society without a wide set of public services. If you don't have an access to education for everybody, if you don't have access to health for everybody, if you don't have a housing policy which stops segregation in the big cities, if you don't have a public transport system which also allows people who don't have a car to move, to have mobility, to get to work, if you don't have a way of creating possibilities that communities, that you break down borders between communities without destroying the communities, you will not build an inclusive society. Bringing back the public sector in that sense is important, but also thinking about ways that the public sector is responsive to the public. We have to think, I think, and that's probably an issue which has come up more urgently in the last years, we have to have a policy that makes migration a success. I'm deeply convinced migration can be a success. It can help societies to become more open-minded, to bring different ideas together, but you have to invest in this. If you just get the poor in the country and you don't help them to integrate, you don't offer them housing, you force them in the black market, you force them into the informal economy, then these migrants will be seen as a threat by many other workers because they feel they undercut our conditions, they undercut what we are doing. So you have to have an inclusive concept of migration. And what I always thought, one of the easiest ways to stop the abuse of undocumented workers would be very simple. We should fight that every worker, every undocumented worker, who takes his employer to court gets as a reward a green card. And the employer is punished. You would turn the power balance by 180 degrees. It would no longer be the employer who say, look, I can call the police, they will deport you and I do not even have to pay you. But it would be a worker to say, I can call the police and I get legalized. You would dry up that kind of labor market of exploitation so easily. And if it doesn't happen, it's not because it's not possible, It's not happening because too many benefit from this particular extreme form of exploitation. Finally, I think if the labor movement wants to regain a more inclusive narrative, we have to think, obviously, about saving the planet. Or being more precise, saving the planet for nature and for human beings. I mean, the planet will be, I mean, the Mars is existing, the Jupiter, but we want to live on this planet. So I think that's where we're talking about. And I think we should be careful in just believing in the green growth model. It sounds so nice. Let's make all green and let's grow and then the problems are solved. I think we have to question to some extent the concept of growth. Now that is the challenge. The 40% very poor in the world need growth. And whoever tells me that someone who has less than $2 a day doesn't need growth, sorry, I disagree. So the question is, can we have green growth for the poor and limit growth for the rich? Look, I have a friend who is building ships. Not he alone, I mean his work is on a shipyard, and they are building this yacht for the Prince of Brunei or Russian oligarchs or whoever. And he said, when I started 20 years ago, we were building yachts which were 50 meters long and 1 million a meter. Today we're building this yachts for the same people who are 180 meters long and 2 million each. And the whole pleasure these people, these men want to have is who has the longest yacht. And so if we reduce that again to 50 millions, no one would lose any pleasure, because it's just as long as the other can't have one of 180, he might be happy with a 50-meter long yacht. So there seems to be that we have gotten to a level of status consumption, not only for the very rich, but also for many of the wealthy, that we have to rethink the concept of growth. And maybe we should try to put the famous Marxian dream from Capital also already into the world of capitalism, where he said there's a realm of necessity where we have to work because we have to earn our living, and then there should be a realm of freedom where we do whatever we like. Teaching, singing, dancing, doing nothing, whatever we like. Now, isn't it time to think about a radical reduction of working time and saying that's the payment, that's the currency for productivity increases for the rich? I mean, Keynes wrote his famous book 30 years, nearly 100 years ago, How Will Our Grandchildren Live? And he said they will work 15 hours a week. Now, everybody works still like crazy, and it seems to me that that needs to be changed, and it can be changed. Look, the top of craziness on working time are probably our friends, sorry Mark, from the US, who are still working and don't believe in the concept of vacation. I think we also abolished the concept of pension. Now, Europe has made other decisions. Europe has worked much less, and a lot of people can work even less, and I'm not sure if we ask who is happier that, you know, the more consumption makes you more happy. Look, what I think is that the challenge is to create diverse unity by interpreting our society through the prism of social justice, freedom, choice, and respect. This means bringing together diverse, legitimate interests for a more inclusive society that limits economic power, offers opportunity for the many, and pushes for democracy and participation at all levels. A society that has the tolerance to respect different identities, as long as these identities not try to suppress others. Colleagues, friends, comrades, I've been fairly general in my talk, and I'm also aware that it's probably a very northern perspective. But I just felt I should speak about something I feel at least some confidence of understanding where I'm talking about. And I didn't dare to walk on the thin ice of development policies with so many people in this room who know so much more about it than myself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've been told that we can take a few questions, so if there are any questions from you. Is there a mic?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jayati. I'm an MA student at the Labor Studies here. I had a couple of questions. First of all, what do you make of attempts by people like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn of taking over the social democratic parties in their country? I mean, you had a similar entryism policy tried by Militant in when they tried to take over the Labour Party in the 80s. It just resulted in a split. What potential for success do you see in reforming these social democratic parties, and, or is the solution just to start a new party? Also, I wanted to ask what engagement you think that the labour movement should have with identity politics. There's a tendency to counterpose the labour movement with social movements in various societies. What relationship do you think these two movements should have? Thank you.
We'll take a few questions together and then.
Good evening, sir. I am Shivangi. I am doing my master's in the same center. So, since you talked about the feminist discourse, so I would like to know what do you think about giving power of representation to the people who are, to the women especially, who are at the lowermost rung of the supply chains, like that of the home-based workers, because in the modern discourse we always see that it's the Western women who come from an elite background, taking the charge, taking the lead in representing worldwide female labor as a homogenized entity. So how do you think does the politics of representation works here? Thank you, sir.
Right. Oh, sorry. Here.
Yeah, you come here.
You come here. Oh. I have. Maybe it's very hard. It's better than here. So, I would like to ask something to Frank Hoffer. But first, I would like to say that I'm very happy.
Just wait for a minute.
I'm very happy with your discourse, that I agree totally. It's a very, for us in Brazil, I think what you said is a lot of things that I think. But some point, for example, I would like to hear your opinion about how we are from the developing country, or we are, for example, in the GLU have a lot of students from the south, the poor country. I would like to know how you can think about how the trade unions from the developed country or middle class or social movement or real democracy parts, how you can think about this asymmetry. How we can say about this international work, because You talk a lot of things that I agree totally, but you have this asymmetry in the word, and for us, for example, it's difficult to think in different kinds of the discussion. We have a huge difficult to hear something about how you can face this international institution, international orders, some of these problems. Then what you said is, I think that is something that have a relationship between the international order, but I think it's more concentrated when
Shall I give it thanks? I come to.
Okay. So, thank you very much for the questions. Starting with Corbyn and Sanders, obviously they have been both running inspiring campaigns but losing elections. Is that sufficient for rebuilding the labor movement where they are standing for? I don't know. I think that what they captured both is a desire and a hope of people on the left of change. I think it came for all of us as a surprise that you need some 70-year-old white men being the inspiring force of a youngish movement, but so be it. What I feel is that some of the thinking is still assuming a way that you can do national policies, which reminds me a bit of the 1981 French government of François Mitterrand, the first government of Mitterrand, where they nationalized the banks, where they pushed a lot, and then they couldn't deal with the capital outflow and all the challenges, and all their consumption program benefited the German producers and so on. So I don't have a very clear opinion of this. I think it's very inspiring what's happening. I'm just sometimes feel that we also have to realize that the more militant and more vocal movements of discontent are in the moment on the other side, and that there needs to be probably still a broadening of the base of the new labor movement. That leads me to your second question of identity politics. I mean, people have different identities. I mean, talking about working class politics of the socialist movement was probably one of the strongest identity politics you could think of. You create a mass movement and saying our identity is not women, men, gay, lesbian, white, black, it's being a worker. You know, workers of the world unite, and that's your first identity. Now, then you have others who have made their first identity being religious, being nationalistic. I feel that the advantage of a working class identity was that it was so easily to be imagined that we are all together, we are many, and we don't have to split them out ourselves. However, this identity, I think, historically was insufficiently respectful for needs of other people in a society. I mean, it can be that in your specific situation, it is much more repressive that how you are treated as a migrant, or how you are treated as a woman, or how you are treated as a gay person. So I think what I said is I think we need to have diversity of identities, and we have to accept that people might have different orientations, but I think we have to resist those who claim their identity as something exclusive that allows them to deny the identity of others. I think that is the dividing point. And I think that's also, to some extent, a bit the difference between minority identity politics, as you know it, who claim for a place in society, and the kind of majority identity policies we see at the moment on the right, which says our identity is not to allow others to have their identity. On the question on women, well, I think at the ILO we had the discussion about the Domestic Workers Convention. And obviously, most of the domestic workers are women. So in the beginning, it was very much also a talk about the exploitation of women. But then it turned out that the majority of the employers are also women. So that you have, at the same time, maybe some common identity interests as women, but you have very diverse interests as those who serve and those who are be served. And I think also in a discussion of the women's movement, I have limited sympathy for the enormous energy which goes into the desire that you have a few more female CEOs in the world. I feel that is a bit, at least from a labor perspective, getting the priorities of the women's movement wrong. I think it's much more important what you raised, to think about that the vast majority of the unprotected, informal, poor workers are women, and if we address that, it will be a huge contribution to strengthen and empower also women in society. Anselmo, your question on the huge inequality and the question, how do we deal with the fact of this structure of the world, and the fact that the powerful nations and the powerful companies are setting the rules and limiting the space for development. I think we have to raise also in the North the recognition that even one planet cannot hold together like a society if it becomes perversely unequal. You cannot, you maybe 100 years ago were parts of the world were far apart from each other, there were no media or very little, there was very little instant communication. You might be able to keep the world really apart. I think today, and I think the migrant and refugee movement has shown this, you have to see the world as a unity. Much more of the world politics have to become internal politics, and we have to win the battle to say, if you want to have a certain peace and stability on this planet, redistribution has to go beyond national borders. It's a very hard sell in the North, I think, and I think the key point is you cannot convince people of the need for growing global justice if they experience growing national injustice. So that the two things have to go together. But I think we can raise, and I think the environmental movement has a lot done for this, to look at things in a global perspective. I think there's no other choice. And the other thing is, it depends also a bit how much we are able to mobilize social movements in the North and the South to say things have to change, and the trade system has to change. But I think the first is what I think that we put forward a narrative where we include this, where we don't retreat to America or whoever first, but to say, look, we have a model of inclusive global development.
Okay, I was told 6:30 is the time, so I'm sorry that I can't take more questions. Round of applause, please, for that amazing, fascinating talk and for the questions. But we thought there's some announcements to be made, so please.
have two small announcements. One is that the Global Labour University Steering Committee will start at 9:30. So steering committee members will be picked up from their accommodation at 8:30 in the morning, and they will have breakfast here before they proceed for the steering committee. There is also transportation organized for those who want to go to the book launch in memory of Sharid Gomez in the evening tomorrow. And all those who are going for the city walk tomorrow should contact Harold and coordinate with him. Thank you.
Chair, with your permission, can I abuse the situation that I'm sitting here and to express an incredible warm thank you to Archana and to Praveen, who have been heroes in organizing this conference. It has been unbelievable. I think Archana is, I mean, I know you're married, but I think you are sleeping with your notebook. Emails every minute of the day, you get an answer. Everything was organized. We know all the problems. And not only was organized, there was a warm hospitality in a situation where we all know you have a lot of stress. So thank you for a great conference and great hospitality.
Professor Chandrasekhar for chairing the session, and I'd like to thank Franco for supporting us, and also Dr. Frank Hoffer for delivering the lecture. Thank you, Chandrasekhar.
This is a request to all the guests and participants who are supposed to leave today or tomorrow. You are requested to coordinate with the travel volunteers. Thank you.